So I'm Joni Adamson, and I'm a professor of environmental humanities and director of the Environmental Humanities Initiative at Arizona State University, and I'm very happy to have all of you here today, and I'm really excited to be working with the members of my panel. So what I wanted to do is start by introducing the theme of our panel, intergenerational justice, by just talking a little bit about my own background in environmental justice. And I think we had some PowerPoint slides, but how does that work? Okay, so.
I didn't know you were going first.
Okay. So let me just get started while we're getting the PowerPoint going, because I'm just going to define environmental justice for you, and then move a little bit into why we're talking about intergenerational justice today. The term environmental justice emerged from the activism of communities of color in the U.S. in the latter half of the 20th century. Environmental justice, or as we sometimes call it, EJ, activists and scholars have raised the visibility of the connections between issues that are typically recognized as quote-unquote environmental, such as degradation of air, water, and land, to issues that are typically recognized as social, such as civil rights, public health, land and resource rights, race, gender, and class politics, poverty, and unemployment, incarceration rates, deteriorating cities, residential segregation, access to green spaces, and affordable, healthy foods. As I said earlier, food is the new smoking. But essentially what EJ activists do is what Shabankar was talking about last night. We connect the dots. So where you might not typically think of incarceration rates as an environmental justice issue or an environmental issue, we do, and we can talk to you about what those connections are. Since these are considered more social issues than scientific issues typically, they tend to be the focus of the humanities, which helps to explain why we're all here today and helps to explain why environmental justice activists and academics have been literally at the forefront of helping to organize the field of the environmental humanities. Today, environmental justice activists who sort of started in the 1980s in the U.S., but quickly this became an international movement. Now we are organizing underneath the umbrella of climate justice and the concept of intergenerational justice, which is the theme of our panel today. David Suzuki, who is sometimes considered an elder statesman in the EJ movement, defines intergenerational justice as, quote, the eco-politics of caring about the futures of all children, all their children's children, and all the great thriving diversity of earthly life, not just humans. So I just wanted to show you some slides. I don't know how. Okay, great, thank you. The question this conference is asking, and which Shabankar introduced us to last night, is how do we get beyond despair when we know so many bad things are happening in the world? And so I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about how we've been thinking about this in the environmental justice movement for the last 15 years. I wanted to bring these slides, which introduce you to my comadres, or my co-mothers. These are the activists and academics I've been working with for 15 years now. Teresa Leal is an activist on the U.S.-Mexico border, Ambos Nogales. She worked for many, many years on the issues of toxins. And as a member of Tucsonans for a Clean Environment, she was one of the first and one of the only activists that have actually won a giant case in court on a toxic issue in an urban area. My friend Giovanna De Quiro is a professor of environmental studies at Swarthmore College. So one of the things we do is we build coalitions. So this is just a small example of the kind of coalitions that we've built through the years to fight off despair and to seek for hope. So 15 years ago, next slide, 15 years ago, we began thinking of ourselves, and this will be a connection, I think, to Shivankar's talk. We began thinking of ourselves as Terras Puentes, or Spanish for bridge beings. Now, I don't have a great Spanish accent, but Teresa was an amazing bilingual translator. And she came up with this idea of Terras Puentes, or bridge beings, which connects to your talk last night. We organized a conference in 2004 in which Teresa suggested that we not only think of ourselves as bridge beings, but think about how we might become bridge beings or educate others to become bridge beings. We, of course, are thinking always of concepts from indigenous peoples. Teresa herself was Mayo Opata, and indigenous people understand animals, plants, rivers, forests, ecosystems as sentient beings. And so we would think of ourselves as working for all of these sentient beings, for our sisters, our brothers, our mothers, our fathers, our children, and our future generations. And again, this does not just mean the human, it means all sentient beings. We find hope in action, just like you were talking about last night, Shamankar. And ours is a hope we embrace in a world that is falling apart. We think of it a little bit like Rebecca Solnit. She calls this hope in the dark. So our hope is not about denial, delusion, or crossing our fingers while hoping for the best. As Rebecca Solnit explains, hope is not the belief that everything was, is, and will be fine. She says, the hope I'm interested in is one that invites or demands that we act. You could call it an account of complexities and uncertainties with openings. So next slide. So we are working on active hope. And this is a hope that Teresa and her colleague, Rose Augustine, began when they started the Toxic Tour. Maybe some of you have been on a Toxic Tour. These are the two women that really started the Toxic Tour. So they organized a Toxic Tour for the American Society for Environmental Historians, and they took us, so this is where they started in the discipline of history, and next slide. And then this is us organizing our conference in 2004. We're illegally visiting, I'll just say, we're illegally visiting a toxic site. Don't tell anybody, but we were there to spy. Okay, notice that we took the babies. Intergenerational justice. This is us we took 99 people across the border. Jen was there. We took 99 people across the border, and we brought them all back. We did not lose anyone. Next slide. And these were some of the questions that we have been asking over the last 15 years, and we don't have time to go through these questions. But, what is it that we bring to the activism, and what is it that we convey? Next slide. And what are our outcomes? There's our outcome. Over the 15 years, we have educated so many people. And here is Jennifer Peacock, who got her PhD at the University of Michigan. She's now at Davidson. And look at her with her six students. 6 students, stand up. Yeah. Okay, you guys, stand up. This is the next generation. Yes. And next slide. And finally, Teresa's son, Jose Beto Soto, is now a professor at the University of Arizona. And this is how we're going to take it into the next generation. So this is our hope in the dark. And now I'm really excited to introduce our panel members so that they can tell us a little bit more about their own work as Terras Puentes, or bridge beings. So we'll start with Dr. Ryan Emanuel. I'll read all of these introductions, and then we'll turn the time over to them. Dr. Emanuel is an associate professor and university faculty scholar in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resources at North Carolina State University. He is an enrolled member of the Lumbee tribe and studies policy issues surrounding environmental justice and indigenous rights, using data-driven analysis to advise tribal governments and indigenous organizations on decisions related to environment and culture. He has written over 40 peer-reviewed articles, and he serves on the Environmental Justice Committee of the North Carolina Commission of Indian Affairs. Today he will speak to us as a Lumbee person about the concept of intergenerational justice as a continuum that flows back and forth between scientific model, cultural idea, and spiritual theme from the perspective of his own people. Next, we'll have Ellen Griffith-Spears, who is an associate professor with a joint appointment in the Interdisciplinary New College Program and the Department of American Studies at the University of Alabama. She teaches Southern Civil Rights and Environmental History and is affiliated faculty in her university's Department of Gender and Race Studies. Her book, and I love this title, Baptized in PCBs. Got to read that. Won several awards, including the 2014 Arthur J. Vizeltier Prize. I said that phonetically. For outstanding contribution to the history of public health. So today she's going to be speaking to us about questions around distributive justice. Finally, Julie Velásquez Runk is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Georgia, one of the only departments dedicated to environmental and ecological anthropology and to research and a research associate at the Smithsonian. I'm sorry, I'm talking too fast, Julie. Tropical Research Institute. She grounds her work in community-based collaborative research using integrative approaches to how people use and manage their landscapes, how that relates to science, conservation, indigenous knowledge, and policy, and how people cope with variability and change. Today, she's going to be talking to us about her work with the indigenous Wunan of Panama and about her views on reciprocity and redistribution for intergenerational justice. So I just want to alert the panel that Tanya is timing us. Each of them have 8 minutes. Tanya will give you the two-minute signal, and then she'll give you the 1-minute signal. Go, Ryan.
Great. Thank you all for allowing me to come into this beautiful and cloistered space. I'd like to read a short new piece that I call The River of Intergenerational Justice. So it was inspired in part by Joni's prompt, but also by the fact that today's April 4th, which is the anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. And his letter from the Birmingham jail includes a powerful image of justice rolling like a river. That image was drawn, of course, from the biblical prophet Amos, who called on justice to roll on like a river. I am Lumbee, and we call ourselves the people of the dark water. Our name honors our ancestral river and its tributary swamps in southeastern North Carolina. Our territory has been described by Lumbee historian Melinda Maynor Lowry as a place of water and soil, two perfect opposites flowing together since ancient times. I'm also a hydrologist, a water scientist, and I've spent more than 20 years studying the flow of water through the environment in the context of ecological processes and global change. In my field, a river is a continuum in both space and time. All points along a free-flowing river are connected to one another. This is why rainfall in one part of a river basin causes a faraway stream to respond, and it's why levees often exacerbate flooding elsewhere. Last fall, as Hurricane Florence trudged across southeastern North Carolina, 20 inches of rain fell across Lumbee land in a single long weekend. That rainfall, concentrated by a converging network of swamps and sandy interstitches, gathered into a flood that expanded beyond the riverbanks and connected neighborhoods, towns, and farms in a free-flowing mass of dark water that connected all points. Rivers also foster continuity in time. The Lumbee River does not jump sporadically from drought to flood. Each day's flow depends on that of the day before. Droughts accumulate over days, weeks, or months, just as floods grow over hours or days. On a free-flowing river, continuity means that everything accumulates and integrates, reacting to what happened immediately beforehand. For 3 million years, the Lumbee River has flowed, free of dams or impoundments, from its headwaters to the sea. Lumbee people are accustomed to the idea of continuity on our river and in other parts of our lives. In the 1880s, excluded from public education by Jim Crow segregation, my ancestors built an institution of their own to ensure the continuity of knowledge flowing from one generation to the next. In 1887, Lumbee forebears established the Croatan Normal School, built from bricks, boards, and $500 allocated by the state. Knowledge, like raindrops, collected into flowing rivulets of mobile young minds. A clapboard building which held 15 grade school students and one teacher in 1888 became a teacher training college by 1926. By the 1950s, the rivulets gathered into a flood of Lumbee teachers who spread across Jim Crow, North Carolina, serving segregated American Indian schools and connecting tribal communities through networks centered around education. My grandmother was one of those teachers. After graduating from our school, which had then been renamed Pembroke State College, she traveled a 300-mile round trip every week to teach at the Halawa Indian School in Hollister, North Carolina. Halawa, Kahari, Saponi, Lumbee, and other tribal communities were connected by the flow of people and information through textbooks, gossip, and even romance. The networks forged by segregation persisted into the era of school integration and American Indian self-determination. Around that time, tribal leaders pressed North Carolina to form the Commission of Indian Affairs to ensure fair dealings with American Indians, to prevent undue hardships, and to promote the rights of American Indians to pursue cultural and religious traditions. Commission leaders chosen by their tribes comprised members of a generation raised in the Jim Crow South, but hopeful for a better future. 4 decades later, the commission formed an Environmental Justice Committee. I was asked to join as one of the few American Indians in the state with a terminal degree in a related field. One of the first issues before the committee was the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, a 600-mile shale gas project slated to run from West Virginia through eastern North Carolina, intersecting the territories of several contemporary tribes and terminating in the Lumbee community of Prospect. Despite the fact that 1/4 of North Carolina's indigenous population live within the pipeline study corridor, regulators concluded that there would be no disproportionate impacts on minority or low-income communities. Tribal governments, the Commission of Indian Affairs, and the National Congress of American Indians condemned the permits under the pretense that a project was not only benign, but was a net benefit to marginalized communities. Regrettably, those communities were never asked what, for them, constitutes a benefit. To the north, the Haudenosaunee people embrace a value of 7 generations. Simply put, make decisions today mindful of their effects 7 generations into the future. However, Dan Wildcat at Haskell Indian Nations University writes about another interpretation of 7 generations given by indigenous scholar Vine Deloria Jr. In Deloria's telling, we're at the center of the 7 generations, living with decisions made by our great-grandparents and making decisions that will be felt by our own great-grandchildren. Deloria's interpretation maps well into one type of Lumbee thinking about social and environmental impacts, benefits, and trade-offs, with the caveat that Lumbee perspectives are as diverse as those found in any large extended family. One key theme is a deep concern about the impacts of decisions on future generations. However, this same thinking is often couched in the context of our ancestors' deeds, the schools they established, and the strides they made to see rights acknowledged or restored. In this thinking, both past and future guide our most important decisions. In the same way that a river carries memory and matter forward in space and time, the present is an accumulation of the decisions made by and imposed upon our ancestors. Our future is thus an intermingling of memory and action. So just to wrap up, some Lumbees are acting in the present to use their stories to raise awareness about the injustice of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. The stories are part of a larger narrative about environmental protection and justice that have currently stalled the project, now 2 years and $3 billion beyond developers' original estimates. However, for these Lumbees, preventing a pipeline is not their principal objective. What they hope for and what they see beyond despair are indigenous rights that are protected and restored, and indigenous values that are appropriately acknowledged and incorporated into discussions about what kind of world we leave for generations in the future, what kind of ancestors we become. One key value for Lumbee people that I'll leave you with is summarized in this quote from Miss Annie Ruth Locklear Revels, captured by Lumbee historian, the late Adolph Dial. Ms. Ruth once stated, "There's more than one way to own a thing. Some of the most precious things were not bought and paid for with money." She spoke those words about our university at a time when its historic campus was threatened, but it also applies to the environment. Lumbee and other indigenous peoples with whom I have the honor to work understand the idea of protecting their territory to be bound up with intergenerational justice. Like rain falling in the headwaters of a river basin, yesterday's storm determines today's response, and what happens now affects moments to come.
Well, I want to say first thanks to Robert Newman and to the National Humanities Center for lifting up the role of the environmental humanities in addressing these important challenges that we face, and I'm honored to be on the panel with these folks. I'm going to talk very briefly about the research I did for Baptized and PCBs, and then talk about some of the work for the new book, Rethinking the American Environmental Movement Post-1945, talking about climate justice. And there's a link. My work rose out of relationships that I established and research conducted in Anniston, Alabama, which, like Durham and Raleigh, is the inland, upland South. Once called a model city of the New South, Anniston became a paradigmatic case of intergenerational injustice. In Anniston, the manufacture of polychlorinated biphenyls poisoned the predominantly African-American west side of town. Toxic chemicals with numerous health effects, liver disease, neurodevelopmental disorders in children, various forms of cancer. PCBs also have intergenerational consequences. Passed to babies through the mother's placenta or through the mother's breast milk, as well as through the broader environment, these chemicals have future genetic consequences as well. PCBs also present a less recognized climate problem, and that is that as the Arctic ice melts, PCBs, which have been stored in that ice, are revolatilized, and they re-enter the atmosphere, increasing the possibility of transmission around the globe. So despite the fact that they were banned in 1976 by Congress, PCBs are not a problem of the past, but they're a problem of the present and of the future. So how do we envision addressing the inequitable distribution of environmental harms and as well as benefits when we include future generations in the calculation? Some ethicists, borrowing from economic theory, discount the value of the duties that we owe to future generations. Future beneficiaries are worth less in their calculations than existing ones. By contrast, we have philosophers like Martha Nussbaum, for example, whose capabilities approach invites us to recognize a responsibility to create conditions for future generations to flourish. Scholars and activists also frame climate justice in terms of fundamental human rights. And here I want to turn to some of the climate justice activists and some of the hope for the next generation who are claiming their voice and pursuing innovative interventions to prompt government action. One example is the litigation in Juliana versus the United States brought by our Children's Trust. And you see here a slide from their website, which is a group of 21 youth plaintiffs, the Earth Guardians, and James Hansen, the NASA scientist who raised the alarm in 1988, on behalf of future generations. These groups sued the Obama EPA in 2015 for inaction that harmed their civil rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The U.S. District Court judge in the case, Ann Aiken, supported their rights-based claim and refused to dismiss the case in 2016, stating, quote, "I have no doubt that the right to a climate system capable of sustaining human life is fundamental to a free and ordered society." In late October 2018, supported by 350.org and the Citizens Climate Lobby, our Children's Trust mounted 62 rallies at sites all across the U.S. and at the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decided in November that refused to halt the case, and so arguments in that case will be heard in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals this summer. Most recently, on March 15th, this was referenced last night, students held climate strikes around the globe. Only mass movements will save us now, writes author and activist Naomi Klein. And by examining photos from the New York Times, you can see what an intersectional movement this is, the kinds of connections that people are making between the climate and other aspects of social justice. They're very much framing the question of climate justice in terms of human and constitutional rights. One broad vision of a sustainable and environmentally just future is the Green New Deal, inspired by the Green Jobs movement and climate activism, outlined in Van Jones and Ariana Conrad's 2008 book, The Green Collar Economy, and promoted by the Sunrise Movement and other groups. The Green New Deal calls for achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions, creating high-wage jobs in the renewable energy sector, constructing a nationwide energy-efficient smart grid, and building resiliency against climate change using green technology and expertise. Promoted in Congress by the newly elected Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others, the Green New Deal enjoys, or at least it did before the partisan spin doctors began attacking it, enjoyed the support of 4 out of 5 Americans, including 92% of registered Democrats and 64% of registered Republicans. The initiative specifically aims, quote, to promote justice and equity for frontline and vulnerable communities. So it's very much continuing a distributive justice theme. These young people and some promising strategies can lead us beyond despair. The closing chapter of this new book is titled Hope in a Strange Season. And I think that a quote from a Nigerian poet, Ben Okri, is in order. He wrote this in 1995 in honor of Ken Saro-Wiwa before the Ogoni, Nigeria environmental activist 1995 execution. Perhaps it's as true, maybe more true today. We live in unnatural times, and we must make it natural again with our singing and our intelligent rage.
Thank you. For those, we have a little rain over here, so I am moving over to the right a little more, so hopefully you all can still hear me. Thanks to the panelists and Dr. Adamson for getting us together here today. And I'd also like to express my gratitude to the wonderful staff and fellows of the center for hosting us in general this year and also for this conference. Over the last 7 months, I've passed this mural most days of the week. It's in honor of now deceased Durham resident Pauli Murray, a civil rights lawyer, poet, priest, and scholar, among her many other talents. And I think it reinforces her points if we read this together. So if you all are game, here we go. True community, oh, come on now. Can you all help me out? True community is based on equality, mutuality, and reciprocity. It affirms the richness of individual diversity, as well as the common human ties that bind us together. Thank you. So this quote exemplifies and yet only implies intergenerational justice. So as Dr. Adamson spoke about earlier, if you weren't as familiar with this term as before now, I think another quick shorthand for it is the obligation to provide future generations with environments in which to flourish. So honing in on true community, Murray suggested the environment, particularly if you come from an ecological background and think of community ecology, but as well as justice beyond a single generation. And her work was also prescient for the ideas of environmental sustainability. Recognizing diversity is foundational to equality. And for me, even in completely different historical, political, and cultural contexts, the physical presence of this mural has been an almost daily reminder of my work this year on ethics, being, and belonging. And it's also served as something of a mandate for action. So I think many of us, particularly those of you who are younger than me, are challenged to know who is and who are our community. For many of us, such as my case, that's because we lead such mobile lives, moving from place to place with families, with jobs, and education. Not only, as Marx would say, are we estranged from nature, we're also estranged from community. Now, I'd have more than 8 minutes. We could perhaps pull this apart a little bit more, and in many ways, historicizing individualism or capitalism, or the decline in wages that requires dual incomes to make ends meet, or many other such items. But I know that in spite of our online communities these days, the volunteerism thought to be a hallmark of U.S. civic life has declined over the past 15 years. And in other places, this broader attention to community has also declined. Scholars have found that in Latin America, the notion of for the common good, which was once enshrined in laws, have been diminished in those same laws over the last several decades. So many of us now have multiple communities, arguably muddying Murray's notion of true community. I've been involved in multiple communities for the majority of my life, and for over 22 years, those have been in Panama and the U.S. And while we might think of those two places as quite different, and indeed they really are, Panama and the U.S. have remarkably similar Gini coefficients, which is a measure of inequality. In fact, while inequality has grown in the U.S. over my lifetime, it's actually decreased in Panama during that same period. So in my mobile world, I've been working with indigenous Huanan people in Panama longer than I've lived in any one place. Huanan, like many indigenous peoples, consider that our everyday world is one in which we are in relationship with many beings, an idea that we've heard repeated in the last day. This recognition of others is something of the equality and mutuality of the Pauli Murray quote that I gave you. However, more than just the people implied by that quote, for Huanan and other peoples around the world, community is a more than human mix of many beings, and not just species, but other beings with vitality and, in some cases, animacy. So we are in relationship with and need to maintain also good relationships with other beings, including mountains, trees, plants, objects, streams, spirits, animals, and others. And so it's a very ecological notion of connectedness and one that is both social and ecological. So in many different disciplines, this more than human relationality has become prominent. Literature's ecological turn, history's post-humanism, anthropology's ontology, art's new materialism, and even engineering's Internet of Things all recognize something of this more than human relationality of human beings with other beings, including objects. So I think by focusing on the relational, that individual is discentered from much of our thought, and it allows attention to others, which facilitates a more reciprocal way of being, or Murray's reciprocity, to focus on giving and sharing within our everyday lives and environments. And that relationality also allows environmental justice thought about the effects on multiple vital others. And in so doing, it's not long before we get to a theme inherent to environmental justice of privilege. Many of us here, and dare I say most of us here, are privileged. For a great many of us, even if one is a Duke student now paying $60,000 a year to go to school, our privileges may be financial. But as we know, there are many axes of privilege: ethnic, political in terms of power, gender, educational. In our individualistic U.S. lives, we sometimes overlook that privilege. And so I encourage you to take a few seconds to think about what privilege or privileges you have. So I'm fortunate that the generous parents who raised me and indigenous Huanan that I work with share an ethic of redistribution. And yet both were embodied, small and sometimes large actions carried out, but very rarely explicitly discussed. For Huanan, most obviously that has been food sharing and also redistribution of windfalls, economic windfalls. But more subtly, that benevolence is reinforced and redistributed by aesthetic beauty, by respectful dance, by the harmony of gender-integrated song, by everyday strength and conviviality with other beings. And it's a relational ethics that's broadly environmental, or a means of intergenerational justice by redistribution. And incidentally, it's that embodied, entangled relational ethics that I'm working with Huanan colleagues to both put on paper and a multimedia website with respect to rosewood and illegal rosewood logging. So the small contribution I'd like to make today to our panel is that we each consider our communities, make a commitment to at least one, and work towards a relational reciprocity. And when we're able, that we begin to redistribute our privilege beyond our families. For intergenerational environmental justice to take place, we as individuals and as part of true community must act to redistribute what we have and what we leave to the world, and to do so with intentionality, so that relational beings and environments may flourish. Thanks.
So we had just one question for each panelist. That each panelist had a question or sent me a question that they wanted to sort of discuss a little bit more with the audience before we open it up for questions, just so that we make sure that we get these issues on the table, and then we'll open it up for questions. So with Ryan, I'm just going to ask you this question. They're sort of tangentially related to the talk, but also extend the talk. You and I have been on some panels before, and one of the things that we've talked about in these other panels, and then again with this one, is the fact that Indigenous people have, like the Lumbee, have been involved in environmental justice communities and struggles for a really long time. So why is it that you think that Indigenous communities are still sort of invisible in these fights? And how can all of us sort of help make their involvement and their knowledge more visible?
Yeah, so in my parents' day, they lived through Jim Crow segregation to the tail end of it and graduated from these segregated schools. In our time, the narrative around environmental justice in the Southeast, in particular North Carolina, has for most of its history been a black and white binary. And that is an important story that needs to be told, but I think it's also important to acknowledge that in Warren County, the Hallawassa tribe was present, and they were there when the PCBs were dumped along the roadsides. And I've heard stories from their elders that talk about the glossy sheen of chemicals in the roadside ditches. So they experienced all of these same injustices that we hear about when we hear the story of the modern environmental justice movement. They're present in the vicinity of hog lagoons and poultry farms and things like this. And so to the question of invisibility, this is the central issue, and what I do in a lot of my public outreach is just to simply heighten the visibility of Lumbee people and other indigenous peoples in this part of the country. And I think it's just very basic education about who we are. That's why I was very grateful that we had such a thorough land acknowledgement yesterday evening during the keynote. These things can be rote exercises, but they can also be delivered in a way that's appropriate and is teachable. And so that's, to me, addressing the invisibility is part of the holistic system of educating people about the indigenous peoples of this region in particular, and just putting us a little closer towards the front of folks' minds when they're thinking about environmental justice.
Yes, one of our colleagues, Kyle Powys-White, who's a Potawatomi philosopher and environmental justice activist, likes to say that the Anthropocene for indigenous people is just deja vu. 500 years, deja vu. So a question that we wanted to sort of emphasize and ask to Ellen is, and this might seem a little bit sort of basic, but I think it's really important for us to emphasize, how did you get from gender studies to environmental justice? In other words, what is the role of gender in the environmental justice movement? And can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, even before the two books we've referenced today, I worked with oral history project in Gainesville, Georgia, with a group of women from the Newtown Florist Club. And they are unlike any garden club that you've ever run into, and they've been together since 1950s as a benevolent society, helping with things like voter registration and recreation for young people. And when environmental justice became more widely understood in the late 80s, they were realizing that their visits to people who were sick in the neighborhood were, they saw a lot of respiratory illnesses and various forms of cancer. And from that, they became one of the important early environmental justice groups. And so they really taught me about the gender connection, that women in a traditional caretaking role were very much committed and leaders in the environmental justice movement. Dorcetta Taylor did a study in the early 90s that showed that while what are often referred to as mainstream, I've recently heard them referred to as Anglo-American environmental groups nationally, the big national groups, have relatively low percentage of women in leadership, that environmental justice organizations have a majority are led by women. And so that was my introduction. But there's some groups that the social justice mission is so much a part of their role that we often don't recognize the environmental leadership that they're providing. And if there's time, I'll mention just one other notion, one other example, which is the Montgomery Improvement Association that led the 1955 bus boycott in Montgomery that desegregated the buses there. 5 of their 8 central demands were environmental demands. They were looking at paving streets and cleaning up the sewers and access to recreation and parks. Those are things today we would think of as environmental justice issues, but they were so much a part of the broader social justice project that they were not acknowledged as such.
And for Julie, your discussion of redistribution is so key to the whole notion of intergenerational justice. But redistribution would, as you sort of pointed to at the end of your talk, would require a lot of acknowledgement of privilege. And sometimes race and ethnic biases and the whole notion of how would we redistribute can be a sort of hard thing to talk about in the classroom and in public. So do you have some ideas about how we can advance our conversations about redistribution and intergenerational justice?
I actually offered this a little bit different of a question, but the same one is one I've received from my graduate students with frequency. And there is just this reticence, I think also particularly because I live in Georgia, to actually talk about difference. And so I've really been trying to talk to students and push the graduate students in particular to very explicitly address difference and to frankly say it's an uncomfortable topic, but if we don't talk about it, we can't overlook those differences. So it's just a means to try and push us forward to kind of engage some of that reticence that I think a lot of us naturally have, but frankly address it and push those conversations, uncomfortable as they might be.
And now we're going to open the floor to your questions.
The microphone is by me, so I will seize it. Environmentalist discourse is often about the future. And I think this is particularly true with climate change, although that may be changing. But all of you insisted upon the importance of the past in your stories, and I think that's true for environmental justice. Ryan, for you, in your final description of time and thinking about generations, you explicitly connected past to future. So what is gained by adding the past and what is not? What is lost when people who are talking about environmental crises leave out the past?
I would address that from the Lumbee perspective. We root ourselves in our past and our ancestors. So who we are is defined by our kinship ties. And in order to do that, one of the first things we do at introductions between two Lumbees who may not have met before is we play a game called Who's Your People? And we trace back through the generations until we find a common ancestor. And then whatever the topic was of discussion, we can then begin. But that is it is a critical orientation in the world, and it frames all of our discussions. What part of Lumbee land do you come from? Who were your ancestors? Who were their kinship ties and things like this. So it's a deeply rooted cultural aspect for us to embrace those ancestral ties and their ties to specific parts of Lumbee territory. So it's the beginning of the conversation for us, and it's necessary, and it's a cultural process.
Well, yeah, I can weigh in on that too. I teach a course called Urban Spaces, and in that we talk a lot about how decisions that were made in the past constrain our options in the future. Martin Malosi's written about this, other people, path dependency, the idea that we are limited in our energy, resource choices, and all kinds of decision making. And of course it intersects with the racial justice issues in that our social relationships are inscribed on the landscape in the form of segregation, and so that shapes who ends up near toxic waste dumps and hazardous facilities. So it's very hard. We're moving in now in the semester to solutions, but it's very hard to think about planning. And they are meeting today with the director of planning from the city of Tuscaloosa. Well, I'm not there. And they are trying to look forward, but without knowing what one student found a few years ago, dug up in the deed records at the county courthouse, the racial covenants from 1937. So without knowing that history, they couldn't really plan for the future.
Could I add something quickly on some of the infrastructure projects that I work on? We're often faced by proposals from developers that argue a position that goes something like this. We have to put this infrastructure here because this is where our other infrastructure is. And it's as if the timeline begins now, and we never walk back a little bit to figure out why was that other infrastructure put there. Let's walk back a half century and think about the decisional processes that went into citing a polluting industry in a particular place. And so I see this in eastern North Carolina playing out a lot with infrastructuring.
In the late 1990s, especially with fish consumption advisories, particularly example here in North Carolina with mercury-contaminated waters, one of the biggest challenges that, for example, the Agency for Toxic Substance and Disease Registry encouraged study on was communication with local residents, particularly people of tribal nations who make it part of their culture to fish in streams that may be contaminated, and how to effectively communicate to them about when and where to fish or how to prepare their foods. And I think that issue on communications remains today, but I appreciate your observations on how that has stayed in place, how it's improved perhaps, or areas that still remain for improvement, consuming groundwater, drinking water from wells, for example.
All right. Well, the Coosa River Keeper, for example, in Alabama, has done some surveys with students going around and talking to fisher folk at the sites where they fish. And the PCBs in that area cover roughly 45 miles of waterway, the EPA has said. And so they're trying to find out how much do the people who are fishing know about this, and does that affect whether they're eating the fish? These are people who are usually using it to add to their diet. So we have a very similar problem, which is that people do not know or are not in a position to regard to pay attention to the fish consumption advisories. We do note, however, in that survey that near the dams, which are run by the power company, the signs are not in evidence. And so this is institutional commercial interest that is really preventing people from knowing what they need to know that would make a difference in their fish consumption.
Thank you for an incredible panel. I wonder if you might want to think with me for a moment on this question I keep sort of thinking about, I get asked. So I work primarily in the Arctic, as I was saying last night, and the leadership, whether we look at arts, writing, environmental justice and indigenous rights leadership, policy, are overwhelmingly indigenous women. And even in my limited 20-year engagement, I keep seeing that most of my teachers are indigenous women who are now elders, but the younger generation is just picking up just an increasing pace. Why is that? Like, why is it that, so I keep thinking about that, where is it coming from? And one of the things which is the harder subject to deal with is health issues, is where I don't know if I mean, I'm speaking out of bounds. This is not my area to contemplate, but I wonder if you might want to contemplate. Why is that? Is one part is intergenerational trauma. So a mother is talking about losing her child to cancer because blah, blah, blah. Or currently in my case in New Mexico, my students are talking about losing their parents or to nuclear colonialism. So somehow this intergenerational picking up of the torch is just happening in a beautiful and inspiring way, but parts of it is rooted in tragedy. So I just wonder if any of you, and you talked about, Ryan, a little bit about intergenerational sort of that trauma, that connection, as well as kinship acknowledgement. If you might just, all of you just think a little bit, where does that come from? I mean, both the leadership as well as, is there a connection?
You know, I have spoken to social scientists who are also Lumbees or members of other tribes in the Southeast, and they tell me, you're a matrilineal people, you're a matrilineal society. And so I hear this in a scholarly way, but I've also experienced it personally through my life. You know, my own teachers and my own mentors, the elders in my life are predominantly women. My mother, my grandmothers, my aunts. And, you know, I have no analysis of that. It's an observation. And it's something that I greatly appreciate. And I think it brings something very special to my perspective. You know, to have the privilege of learning from my aunts and my mother and my grandmothers is something that I value. I can't analyze or discuss in any more depth than that.
Yeah, and that isn't true where I work. So most of the interlocutors are men where I work, so it is quite different. And I think it's different for each different culture, right? But none are famously egalitarian, where men and women are quite equal but have different gender roles. But men are often the interlocutors with more of the outside world. So.
Well, and I'll just add that all of the activists that I've worked with have been women because they have predominantly been the organizers. And I don't think this is just because they're mothers, although they were all mothers. I think it's because they have good relationships in their neighborhoods or good relationships among their tribal members. Or in the case of Teresa Leal, who I worked with, The Opata were the story keepers. So anciently, the Opata would go on the migratory routes through the Sierra Madre, and then, we call it crossing the border, but back in those days there was no border, and they would do this the migration route, taking the stories and the histories with them, and also collecting herbs along the way, and then redistributing the herbs, along the migration route. And so Teresa still saw herself as the story keeper / sort of historian, but she saw these horrible things happening with the buildup of toxins on the U.S.-Mexico border with the maquila system. So pre-NAFTA, post-NAFTA, just this real buildup of toxins. And babies were being born with encephalitis. People were, getting ovarian cancer, breast cancer, all kinds of cancer, and they had a serious cancer cluster. So, the EPA will say, well, that will take 20 years for you to prove that there's an actual sort of connection between all of this, all of these chemicals that Hughes aircraft is dumping in the drain and pouring into the aquifer. It's going to be 20 years for you guys to prove that there's those causal links. And those women were they were already organized in their communities, in their churches, mostly Catholic churches, and in their tribes. And they just took it on, and it took them 20 years of just never giving up to win that lawsuit. And it's really one of the only lawsuits that an environmental justice group has won, but they won it.
I was typing an email to Ryan, and I thought, what a better thing to do to ask you directly. Are you able to say anything more about the First Peoples' relationship to the Warren County Toxics and Race in America? I think the report was called. That would be nice to know. And I only know it as an Afro kind of story. The Ben Chavis report and all of that. And then the other thing was I was not here last night, but you credited somebody for doing an introduction. Could you say a little bit more about that too?
Yeah, I think it was the Indigenous Peoples Day Proclamation that Governor Cooper signed that you read from. And so North Carolina, as you correctly noted, adopted Indigenous Peoples Day starting in 2017. And the proclamation named all 8 of the tribes recognized in the state. Of course, it's very complicated because we also have some non-recognized indigenous groups within the state as well. So while I agree that it's appropriate to name the tribes in the state and not get into the politics, sometimes it can get thorny. With respect to the report leading out of Warren County, the seat of the Halawa-Saponi tribe is in Hollister, which is about 10 or 12 miles away from Afton, where the PCB landfill was sited. I'm not aware of Halawa-Saponi involvement in preparation of the report, but I do know that there were Lumbee activists who were involved in that gathering of religious groups. I'm blanking on the name of the denomination that led that report, the United Church of Christ. There were Lumbees involved in some of those meetings that led to the production of that report that preceded the Federal Environmental Justice Executive Order in 1994. Some of those Lumbees were also involved in a proposal or resisting a proposal to site a toxic waste disposal facility in the Lumbee River headwaters. This is not well known in North Carolina, but in the mid-1980s, there was a proposal to site a facility in Scotland County upstream of Pembroke and Lumberton, and community protest eventually pressured the state of North Carolina to put stricter rules in place about the siting of such facilities near water resources, and I believe it led the EPA to actually sue the state of North Carolina for having regulations that were too strict. And so there was some state and federal standoff for a little while. Eventually, EPA backed off. North Carolina was able to prevent at least this one facility from being built in Scotland County. And so that was a success that came on the heels of the major disappointment of the siting of that PCB landfill in Warren County just a couple of years before.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for this really amazing talk. And I had a question just about, like, I guess climate change, and obviously how climate change is gonna, I mean, many changes are gonna come, but I think a really important one is community and how communities are gonna shift. And Ryan, you showed a picture at the beginning of your presentation and about how the hurricane flooded your whole community and your whole territory. So obviously in your community, the land on which you live is really important. But if amongst other things, climate change brings to climate migration, and you're forced to leave your land, how do you like envision the future, I guess, in that sense? And also just in terms of how, I mean, we see in Durham and we see in many communities, like gentrification is happening at a scary rate. So how, if you're forced to leave your home, your community, how would you be able to integrate a new space and have, and still be a key stakeholder, and have your voice still be valued and be a part of I guess, this new community? I don't know if this makes sense, but.
For Lumbee people, and really for all rural communities living in the coastal plain, the southeastern coastal plain, this specter of hurricane-induced or tropical storm-induced flooding is a major climate change impact. And so we saw Hurricane Matthew, and then less than 2 years later, Hurricane Florence created even larger floods. And so, moving away and giving the river its space is one response to dealing with those types of floods. Unfortunately, you can't deconvolve the climate change problems from land use change problems in this part of the country. And moving away from these flood-prone areas would involve moving into uplands. And these uplands in the rural coastal plains are the places where we're increasingly citing things like industrial poultry facilities. Even though we have a moratorium on swine CAFOs, it's basically hands-off when it comes to poultry. And we now have twice as many poultry CAFOs in North Carolina as swine CAFOs, and they're increasingly occupying these dry upland areas that would otherwise be great places for people to, when people migrate away from flood-prone areas, many of them are not looking to move to Raleigh or Charlotte or Richmond or these other places. They want to stay home. So migration looks like moving uphill. But if we've completely covered these uphill or upland or upslope areas with polluting infrastructure like poultry CAFOs, we've really squeezed out the habitable parts of the landscape, right? We have floods in the lowlands, we have stink in the uplands, and we've really left nowhere for people to live. So that's one of the key challenges, and I think it's why we can't talk about climate change without also talking about land use change and things like zoning and local ordinances and things like that. So I don't have a beyond despair departing note for that, but I have a strong word of caution in that when we talk about industrialized agriculture, we have to talk about it at the same time that we're thinking about what we're going to do in the face of increased flooding risks.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Unfortunately, it's not a small question. And I've been trying to shrink it into some manageable format, but I've been really struck by all four of these really marvelous presentations that I don't think it's a coincidence that each of you hail from public universities. And I just actually wanted to invite you to think about the ways that intergenerational justice, particularly, Julie, I thought you brought it out so beautifully, also really implies an ethics of redistribution. And I loved that you just said, like, if you have a windfall, you need to redistribute it, right? And the windfall, the institutions that I think of all the time that have huge windfalls are the Ivies. And at the risk of burning down my own house, I'm wondering, or I'm wanting to invite you to think about how can private universities with our windfalls be better allies in the reinvention of civic educational commons, in public education, in understanding what it means to really redistribute the huge monies that we have.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and I also recognize those differences between private and public education in the U.S. But I think one of the issues we have in the academy is that the focus on the individual researcher or individual science, and even when we do collaborative teams, they're often other academics rather than communities and academics excuse me, together. So I think that's part of our our challenge in collaborating excuse me, beyond the academy. So I think that's one way to do it. But I also, as part of that, the expectations for what is success in the academy would also have to change, right? So it's not just peer-reviewed journal articles, it would be technical reports or educational materials as well. And I think that's the greater challenge for the academy.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that that one of the things that the environmental humanities has tried really hard to innovate is what would integrated co-designed research look like. If integrated co-designed research means interdisciplinary research that integrates both the humanists, but also community members, what would that look like? And one of the things that the environmental humanities is really trying to do is sort of model projects that are taking those questions and realizing what it would look like. So we have networks around the world that are doing this work, and talk to us, and we'll tell you where you can locate these projects and take a look at them.
Please join me in thanking this panel for these wonderful presentations.